I'm Kittredge. I'm a senior investment officer at the Maine Technology Institute. We've been doing these collaborative score meetings for probably 4 to 5 years now, at least that I've been involved. Always surface some really great questions. We often have folks who attend these, then go on to get MTI funding. So yeah, hopefully this will be an informative conversation. Happy to take questions at the end. Feel free to put questions in the chat. Dan, you can flag those for me. And yeah, we'll dive right in. So let me go ahead and just share my PowerPoint deck. That should say July 2026, but hopefully you'll all forgive me on that. So for those who aren't familiar with the Maine Technology Institute, we are a nonprofit, though we're primarily funded through the state of Maine. So we somewhat operate as a quasi-state agency, even though we're technically separate from the state. So I'm not a state employee, for example. I'm just an employee of the nonprofit. But like I said, most of our funding comes from the state, and we try to work in tandem with the state on their economic development goals. And really, our core mission is to diversify and grow Maine's economy through supporting innovation. So, really, the hope being that by providing resources to companies engaged in innovation, that will allow them to take risks, to grow their innovation, and in turn, create economic impact in the state of Maine. So, really, our mission is to figure out a way to catalyze Maine's innovation sector, companies engaged in innovation in Maine as a means to create economic impact in the state of Maine. So that's kind of the core of what we do. And we have a variety of different programs we've built around that core mission. But just kind of overarching, I think that's the number one thing to understand about MTI is innovation as a means to economic impact. So just a brief history of MTI, just for some stage setting. So we were established by the Maine legislature back in the late 90s. At the time, Maine lagged behind pretty much the entire rest of the nation in terms of investing in research and development, investing in innovation, essentially. And I think policymakers at that point felt that if Maine wasn't more proactive in investing in innovation and bolstering certain key sectors, that there was a risk that going into the 21st century that we would lag behind. So they intentionally created MTI to invest in innovation, along with our sister organization, the Maine Venture Fund, which has a similar mission to MTI, but is specifically focused on investing via equity in scalable companies, whereas we have a broader approach. Just a few cool numbers, I think, in terms of what we've achieved over the past 25 odd years. So almost 400 million invested in Maine innovation. Over 4,000 projects funded across all seven sectors. So MTI was created with a focus on seven technology sectors. I'm going to go into those in more depth in a moment. But the key thing is, there's seven sectors we focus on and over 4,000 different projects across those seven sectors. And over $2 billion of matching funds. So one of the key things for MTI, and this is part of our statute with the state of Maine, is that for any project we fund, we look to see that the applicant brings at least one-to-one match to that, ideally more. So that's why, 2.2 billion matching 400 million means we've had a really a great kind of ratio in terms of what we've been able to attract as match. So essentially $6 of private investment for every dollar MTI has put in. So I'm going to talk a lot more about match later on. I'll talk more about what we mean when we say project and what we mean by sectors. But these are just kind of some stage setting in terms of cool numbers for us. So this slide, the scope of MTI funding, really what it is trying to convey is that we work with companies at all different stages of their growth trajectory. So we work with companies who are just at the idea stage, all the way to companies that have been in the market for decades and are maybe looking to spin out a new product or, level up their innovation. For the earliest stage, so idea might be slightly earlier than is the reality. It's idea plus some groundwork, some validation. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to have a prototype or a minimum viable product, but we do look to see companies that have done some research. Ideally, they've talked to some prospective customers. They've looked into the competitive landscape. They've done things to validate the idea, but that's still quite early stage. And again, all the way up to companies who have been in the market for a long time. So in terms of what we offer programmatically to support innovation in Maine, we have a number of programs. Today's session is primarily going to focus on the Business Innovation Funding Program, which is really our flagship program and probably the one that's most relevant to this particular audience. We do offer a number of other programs that are also worth knowing about. The other one that's probably most relevant to this group of folks is the Maine Entrepreneurial Resource Corps. And then so I'll talk through all of them. So like I said, today, primarily business innovation funding, though I'm happy to take questions on any of the rest. Um, Business innovation funding is really our program that puts out money via grants, loans, and equities to businesses that are doing something innovative. So really, like I said, when I talked about our mission, this is how we achieve that mission, is putting out money, grants, loans, and equity to businesses in Maine who are doing something innovative and who are looking to scale in Maine and create economic impact. The Maine Entrepreneurial Resource Corps is linked to that idea of business innovation funding, but it's more specific in terms of where the money is going. So really the intention of the Maine Entrepreneurial Resource Corps is to help innovative companies in Maine hire Maine-based consultants. So whereas business innovation funding can be for an array of projects, it can span, investing in research and development of a product to doing some sales and marketing work to filing for a patent to, running a pilot program. The Entrepreneurial Resource Corps is really specifically focused to helping folks hire a consultant for a short-term need that's relevant to their business. The consultant should almost always be based in Maine. We make some very rare exceptions if uh, you have a particular consulting expertise that just doesn't exist in the state of Maine. You may be able to get some support to hire a consultant outside of the state, but ideally we look to help people hire Maine-based consultants. That way, we're putting the money back into the state of Maine. And those consulting projects can be anything from hiring a consultant to help you flesh out your human resources manual, to hiring a software engineer who's going to help you add a key component to your product, to hiring a patent attorney who's going to help you file for a provisional patent, to hiring a leadership consultant who's going to help, the leadership team acquire some key skills. So, quite flexible in terms of where that money is going, but it has to be specifically to a consultant who's Maine based. And then quickly, these other ones, which might be less pertinent to this group, but event sponsorship, typically it's for nonprofits, occasionally for profits, but really entities that are looking to host events that celebrate and champion and educate on Maine's innovation economy. The key word there being event, obviously. So the sponsorship is really intended that if you're looking to host an event and bring people together to do something that celebrates champions, educates on innovation, MTI might be able to provide some amount of funding to support that. Typically, event sponsorship goes up to $5,000. On a rare occasion, we can go higher than that, but the norm would be up to 5,000. And as in return for that, MTI would like to be listed as one of your sponsors for that event. But again, key thing is it's really only events that celebrate, champion, and educate on Maine's innovation economy. It's not any old event. Federal funding technical assistance program. So the federal government offers a variety of different programs, grant funding for companies in certain key areas that are doing really interesting research and development work. So pretty much every major U.S. agency, so the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, has grants to invest in companies who are doing interesting research and development work that's aligned with the goals of that particular federal agency. A couple things to note about this program. So what MTI does is we help companies apply for this program. So we don't administer this program ourselves. It's administered by each of the individual agencies. What our goal is to try to bring more of this money that's available on a federal level into Maine. And so what we do is we work with people who are interested in applying for those federal grants by giving them technical assistance. So basically, expert guidance on how to submit a compelling application. And we have a few folks on our team who have been doing this for decades. So they're great at helping people submit these sorts of grant requests. The SBIR, STTR grants can be really impactful. I think there's different phases of funding you get. I think the first one might be as much as up to 250,000. And then the next one is, I think, over 1 million and so on. A couple things to note about them, though. So they're for companies that haven't commercialized yet, so they don't have sales and are high risk research and development. So basically what that means is by high risk, they're actually looking for you to make the argument as to why your research and development might not work, why it's complex enough, technically challenging enough that it's not a slam dunk. And the money really is intended to go specifically to research and development. So it's not for every company. It's really for companies that have a heavy capital intensive research and development need and are doing some really interesting high risk work. But if that's you, that could be a really good fit. And again, MTI can help you submit an application for one of those. Entrepreneur support organization funding. This is funding we put out to our partner organizations in the ecosystem. So again, typically nonprofits, occasionally for-profits, but entities like, for example, SCORE. Last year's winners were Startup Maine, the Rue Institute, Bigelow Laboratories, and Derigo Labs, Central Maine Growth Council. So, those are all institutions that were doing work, programmatic work to support Maine's entrepreneurial and innovation economy in different ways. And we'll be running another edition of this particular program, which is a competitive program, soon. So it's launching in August, application deadline in October. So if that's relevant to you, stay tuned. And then lastly, additional programs. So on occasion, we'll run one-off programs. For example, we ran the MTAF 3.0 program recently, which is, folks might recall, back in November of 2024, Maine voters passed a $25 million research and development bond for companies engaged in research and development in Maine. MTI was asked by the state of Maine to administer that, so we ended up running that program. That program is over. We're not running anything similar at the moment, but just to highlight that occasionally we kind of run these one-off programs. So now kind of to the key piece that I wanted to speak about today with is the Business Innovation Funding Program. So as I mentioned earlier, really what we call it BIF, Business Innovation Funding, really what BIF is intended to do is provide resources to businesses in Maine that have an innovation that's core to their business, and that innovation is going to allow them to scale because it creates some sort of competitive advantage for them in the market. And they're able to take MTI resources along with their own resources to invest in growing the innovation and in turn grow the business and in turn create economic development. So that's really the core of what business innovation funding is seeking to do. Typically, when a company comes to us for the first time, we work with them on grant funding. Most first-time grants are between $10,000 to $30,000. Occasionally, if you're a business that has a really strong economic impact argument and you're farther along in your trajectory, we're able to provide larger amounts of grant funding, up to 100,000 cumulative. What's more common is for a company to come to us, get an initial $30,000 grant, execute on the grant, grow the business, and then come back for follow-on funding. So the key thing to think about in terms of that 100,000 cumulative grant cap is it's 100,000 that you're able to get in grant funding from MTI over the lifetime of the company, but that can be broken down to any number of grants. So you could hypothetically get 10 grants of 10,000 each. You could get 2 grants of 50,000 each. You could get 1 grant of 100,000. And it's really, the size of those awards are dictated by how far along are you as a business. We have certain kind of expectations for different amounts of grant funding. What do you need the money for? And do you have a compelling project that's going to, you can make an argument that you need X amount of money. And what's the economic impact potential of your company? So a company that's only realistically going to create 1 to 2 jobs in Maine might not have as compelling an ask as a company that can make a strong case that they're going to create 5 or 10 or more. And again, I'll go into all of these kind of components in more depth in a moment. So in terms of key requirements to business innovation funding, so we internally refer to it as FIT. So fit to the program. What are the things that as a business you need to definitely have to consider yourself a potential fit to business innovation funding? And I'm going to go into each of these in more depth. So very quickly, economic impact potential, innovation and forward thinking, Maine-based organization, within 1 or more of our 7 targeted technology sectors, and access at least to one-to-one matching funds. So by economic impact potential, I'm actually going to move where the Zoom is because it's blocking my view of the text. What do we mean when we say economic impact potential? So the key metric we look at is the creation or retention of quality jobs statewide. So when we were created, really one of the goals of the state of Maine was to spur job creation, high quality job creation. So not minimum wage job creation, but living wage, jobs that people can have to live a comfortable lifestyle. So that's one of our key priorities that we look at when we consider economic impact. But it's not the only one. We try to take a very holistic view of what it means to have economic impact in Maine. So other things we look at are the growth and acceleration of revenues, Obviously, if a company is growing its revenues in Maine, that has other benefits to the state, for example, tax revenue, and other forms of revenue. So that's something that we look to when we consider economic impact potential. Attraction and leveraging of capital. So if you're able to make a case that your business is growing in such a way that you're going to attract investment capital into the business from other parts of the country or other parts of the world, that's great. And then indirect or secondary impact. So that's basically anything else that you can make an economic impact argument for. So that could be that you're working with Maine-based suppliers. So, other companies in Maine basically benefit from your success. Maybe your customers are based in Maine, and so those customers are benefiting. Maybe you're, developing a technology that's going to also benefit other companies in your sector. So we try to take a very broad look at economic impact. One question I often get is, do you look at other forms of impact, such as societal benefits or environmental benefits? And the answer is yes. But, because of our mandate, economic impact is the key metric we have to look at. So that always has to be there. But other forms of positive impact, such as, social impact, environmental impact, can help an application, but they're not sufficient on their own. The economic impact has to kind of be there and be a key cornerstone. The innovation standard. So innovation is kind of a very nebulous term. I think a lot of people think that what they're doing is innovative. And so MTI over time has tried to provide a little more clear guidance as to what we mean when we say innovation. So we have what we call an innovation standard, which provides a little more detail as to what we mean by innovation, acknowledging that, within different sectors, within different businesses, innovation can mean something very different. So really what we're looking to see when we say innovation are you being able to make the credible case that what you're doing drives scaling and significant main economic impact. So we've already talked about that economic impact, but linking the innovation to the economic impact. It can't be that your business is going to generate economic impact and you have an innovation, but the innovation isn't what's driving your business growing. It has to be that you can create a clear linkage between the innovation and the ability of your business to grow in such a way that it's going to create that economic impact. Create a competitive advantage by being substantially different from existing alternatives. So we look to see, can you make an argument that what you're doing is distinct from what's already out there on the market and that it's gives you essentially some form of competitive advantage. So you have something that's innovative, that's enticing to your customers, or it's going to allow you to deliver your product or service cheaper or better, what have you. But basically, it should give you a competitive advantage. And then related to that is have a credible path to defending that advantage against competitors over time. So if your argument is your innovation is something that, maybe it is innovative, but any of your competitors could do the exact same thing and there's no reason, nothing stopping them. So barriers to entry, essentially, nothing stopping them from replicating your exact innovation. And that barrier might be that you're going to file for IP protection, or it might be that your team has a really unique knowledge set that your competitors wouldn't have, or it might be that there's a first mover advantage. So because you're the first people in the market doing this innovation, it's going to be hard for your competitors to follow you. But you have to be able to kind of articulate what that is. So those are really the key components that we look to see when we assess innovation. So again, really essentially what it is you saying, hey, my innovation is going to give me a competitive advantage that's going to allow me to grow my business as a result of that. So things that don't typically meet the standard. And the key thing here is that not sufficient on their own language. So it's great if you have any of these things within your proposal, but you can't use them in and of themselves to meet the innovation argument. There has to be more than just these. So things that wouldn't on their own meet the innovation argument is if you're buying off-the-shelf equipment or software purchases, and that includes innovative off-the-shelf equipment or software purchases that another company has created. So what that looks like is if you say, hey, I want to buy this really innovative piece of equipment that somebody else created, that typically wouldn't be alone sufficient to meet the innovation standard. If it's something that's somebody else's innovation and you're just buying it, we typically are looking to see your own innovation. There are occasional exceptions, but that's generally the norm. Routine integration of existing components. So if you're just sticking a bunch of things together and saying, this is my innovation, that's typically not sufficient unless there's some serious technical work that goes into kind of combining those items. AI wrapper applications. So, obviously with the prevalence of AI, MTI is seeing a tremendous amount of interest in the AI space and a lot of applications with people claiming that their innovation is AI. And basically, again, we want to see that there's real technical research and development, work that goes into whatever your AI product is, not something that most people could create. You have to be able to demonstrate why is there a barrier to entry? What about this requires some technical work? Combining or repackaging existing products or ingredients. Um, this is similar to routine integration, but occasionally we'll have food companies come to us and say, hey, I have an innovation and it's this new recipe that nobody's made this recipe before. Typically, that's not sufficient to meet our innovation standard. There might be a really interesting manufacturing component to developing that, and that manufacturing component requires some research and development, and that's where the innovation lies. But just combining, just creating a new recipe typically isn't sufficient. Incremental improvements to existing business practices. So, it can't just be something where you're just slightly tweaking a business model and saying that's our innovation. Geographic novelty. So we often have people come to us and say, hey, I'm going to be the first person in Maine to offer this service or have this innovation. Typically, that's not sufficient, both because, the barrier to entry piece exists. So, just because you're the first doesn't mean somebody can't come in and do the exact same thing next week. Also, because typically we're looking for companies who have ambitions to offer their products and services beyond just Maine, simply because typically the Maine market isn't sufficient to grow the sorts of businesses that MTI is looking to support on their own. Again, there can be exceptions to all of these, but just as a general rule of thumb, creative works using existing tools. A common experience we have is people who are developing video games, or developing a new movie or something of that nature. If you're just using existing tools to create that, it typically wouldn't meet MTI's criteria. If you were developing your own video game creation engine, that might be a better fit, but just using existing tools typically isn't sufficient. And then relationships, location, pricing, or branding alone. So if you're saying, oh, our innovation is we have a really good connection with this person or this company, or we have a really unique brand, that typically wouldn't be sufficient on its own. So again, I say typically because there's always exceptions. We don't apply any of these as a hard and fast rule, but we just try to provide some guidance as to what typically isn't sufficient in of itself, just so people can kind of go in. But if think that you might have a exception or a really strong case in one of these spaces, I definitely say talk to an MTI representative and they can give you some more guidance in that space. Maine-based organizations. So again, we're funded primarily through the state of Maine, which means we're primarily funded through state of Maine taxpayers. So we really want to ensure that our money that we're putting out the door is going back to the state of Maine, in alignment with why we exist. So there's a few requirements we have around being a Maine-based entity. So well, actually, let me take one step back, which is to just say, in today's day and age, we very much realize and appreciate and accept that lots of companies have employees all over the country or even all over the world. We don't expect companies to be exclusively based in Maine. What we're looking for is companies that are predominantly based in Maine, so that can make the credible case that they are more based in Maine than they're really based anywhere else. What we can't support is a company that has 200 employees in New York and 5 employees in Maine. Even if they're planning to grow their employee base from 5 to 10 people in Maine, they're really not a Maine-based entity, so they wouldn't be a good fit for us. But kind of in more granular detail, things we're looking to see are that the organization is registered with the Maine Secretary of State. That just has to be done at the point before you receive funding. It's a pretty simple process. You just go to the Bureau of Corporations website, file to be registered with the state of Maine and be licensed to do business in the state of Maine. There's a small fee. I think it's in around $100. And again, that just has to be completed at the point that you receive MTI funding, not at the point you apply. Has a regular place of business in Maine. We take a very flexible definition of what a regular place of business is. We accept people who are working out of their home offices, but you can't just say, well, I have a PO box in Maine. It has to be somewhere where work is actually done, even if it's from somebody's home or a co-working space or something like that. And then this is probably the one that's most specific and precise, which is has to have at least one of the following based in Maine full time. So either a C-suite level W-2 employee, so basically somebody in a key leadership role who's on a salary, is the best way to think of that. That's why we say W-2 employee. So a contractor wouldn't be sufficient. It has to be somebody who's on a salary in a leadership position, or a founder or principal with significant equity ownership in an active leadership role. And the reason that or exists is we recognize that many early stage companies don't have salaries. So if you're an early stage startup, you're not paying anybody a salary yet, but one of the founders is based in Maine. And it's not just a founder in name, they have a significant equity ownership and an active leadership role. That would also be sufficient to meet that criteria. So you just have to have one or the other, not both. And lastly, down in the bottom here in italics, companies in a main accelerator university program may also qualify. So if you're a company who's going through one of the accelerator or incubator programs in the state, so for example, the founder residency at RU or Dirgo Labs, or the Upstart Scratchpad program up in the Bangor region, even if you're a company that's not fully based in Maine. So, for example, the founder residency at RU often has companies from outside of Maine come to participate in the program. We would typically allow a certain amount of funding to go to those companies as long as they can demonstrate that they're intending to remain in Maine after the duration of the program and meet all of our other criteria. So our seven technology sectors, again, these were defined by the state of Maine back in the late 90s. These are the seven sectors that we were tasked with investing in. They are not very clearly defined by the state of Maine, which has actually been quite nice for us as an entity because it means we can be very flexible with how we think about these sectors. And also, it means that as technology has evolved over time, we've been able to be flexible. So, for example, with information technology, I think there might be some background noise. With information technology, in the late 90s, when information technology was included as one of the sectors for MTI to focus on, things like AI or machine learning were not really part of the conversation at all. But because these sectors were very broadly defined, we've been able to be flexible and kind of evolve with the times and how we'll define those. Um, so one other point just to make on this slide, up here at the top, it says organization or innovation in one or more of the following sectors. So your company itself doesn't have to necessarily consider in one of these sectors as long as the innovation is. So again, using information technology as an example, if you're a company who wouldn't cleanly fall in one of these sectors, but your innovation is very clearly an IT innovation and meets all of our other criteria and definitions,
Good idea.
would also be able to provide support for you in that regard, um, assuming, again, you meet the other criteria. Um, so last kind of key fit component is access to matching funds. So we are required by the state of Maine to have at least one-to-one match for any project we support. Um, so essentially, it's co-share on the project that MTI is supporting. So if you're saying, "Hey, I have a project in mind. It's going to cost $100,000. MTI, could I have X amount of money?" We would say, "Okay, well, if your project's going to cost $100,000, we could at most put up 50,000 with the expectation that you figure out a way to pay for the other half of it yourself." That 50,000 example assumes that you meet the criteria to apply for up to 50,000, but the key kind of thing to emphasize there is that you'd have to have at least one-to-one match. We are able to accept a portion of the match in what we call in-kind match. So typically that manifests as sweat equity. So if you are a founder who's going to be working on the proposed project, you're going to be putting in, dozens, hundreds of hours into the project. We can essentially take the value of your labor. We can basically say, well, if you were to pay somebody to do this work, if you were to hire somebody, it would cost this amount of money. So we're going to count that towards your match. Um, there are some limitations. So it's capped at a $50 per hour rate. So once you go above $50 an hour, even if you would have to pay somebody $75 an hour or $100 an hour to do the work, you can only calculate it at $50 an hour. And then that ability to use in-kind match decreases proportionally depending on how much you're asking. So you can see here at up to 15,000 in terms of the size of the request, you have to have at least 50% cash match. And then as you ask for more money, the amount of cash match we're looking to see gets higher and higher. Okay, so in terms of the types of fundings, I've already touched on this briefly, but most first-time MTI awards are grants. Loans and equity are typically designed for later stage companies. However, if you are a later stage company and you come to MTI for funding, we may be able to make a loan or an equity investment. And the advantage of those two products is that they're typically larger sums of funding. So grants, typically first-time grant is up to 30,000 and there's a cumulative lifetime grant limit of 100,000, whereas loans range from 50 to 300,000. Same with equity, and we occasionally will go even higher than that. We've made awards of 500,000 or even higher. But kind of the profile of companies applying for each of these types of funding differs. So for grants, typically for earlier stage companies, companies that are developing their innovation, looking to commercialize it, we have three different tiers of eligibility. So 10 to 30K, 30 to 60K, and 60 to 100K. Um, I'm going to go into what the profile of each of those tiers looks like in a moment. So just one thing to note. And then again, there's that 100,000 cumulative grant cap over the lifetime of the business. For loans, those are typically for commercialized companies. So by commercialized, I mean companies that are in the market who essentially have sales and can show that they'll have the profile to repay the loan. So our expectation is that this loan is going to be repaid. So we want you to be able to demonstrate that you have the cash flow sufficient to repay the loan. With that said, I would say that the loan terms themselves are pretty compelling. So it's a standard 5% interest rate. We don't take a personal guarantee. There's no collateral. And typically, we're able to be flexible with developing the repayment timeline. So we're often able to wait for repayments to start till after the project is completed. Um, we typically can be flexible in terms of how long the loan goes. Standard is 5 years, but we can be a little flexible in either direction. So we try to build loans around what the profile of the company is. And then equity, those are our rarest investments. We don't do many equity investments. I'd say probably fewer than 10 a year compared to, hundreds of grants that we put out a year and probably closer to 20 to 30 loans a year. They're for scaling companies that are in the process of fundraising, that have a lead investor. So you need to be able to show that there's somebody leading the round, demonstrated product market fit. So you're able to show that you're in the market and your customers are essentially loving what you're offering. And there's a compelling return on investment opportunity for MTI. So for equity, we're looking for opportunities where we see a real chance for us to get a nice return. And they need to receive initial approval from our equity review team. So like I said, these are the rarest. Typically, companies who get equity from MTI have already received other forms of funding, either grants or loans. We have a strong relationship with them. So if you're a first-time company at MTI, you basically wouldn't be eligible for equity. So you'd be looking at grants or loans. Again, equity is really for companies who are already within our portfolio who are looking for some additional funding to scale. So going back to those three tiers of grant funding, so just to give a sense of what a fundable company looks like in each of those three tiers. So up to 30,000 ecosystem seeding is what we call it. So we're looking for you to have a strong innovation concept, but we have a very high risk tolerance. So we're not expecting the business model to be fully ironed out. We're not expecting you to have even a prototype or a minimum viable product yet. We're just looking for you to make a credible case that there's a business opportunity and an innovation and a chance for economic impact. But we kind of understand that a lot of the details are going to be ironed out as you grow the business. 30 to 60K, typically by then we're looking to see companies with a prototype or a minimum viable product, documented work in terms of developing it, stronger customer evidence, so really strong evidence that you've gone out to understand the market, to talk to prospective customers, a better sense of how much it's going to cost to create your product, how much you hope to sell it for, and basically how you get to become a profitable business. And then 60 to 100K, those are really for businesses that are on the verge of entering the market or already in the market, who have products that are close to being ready to sell, who have really strong validated customer demand. So even if you haven't sold anything yet, maybe you have letters of interest or letters of support. And then some pretty comprehensive, well-prepared financial projections. So again, these are really for companies that are on the cusp of entering the market. Um, So in terms of what sort of projects MTI funds and which ones are not a good fit for MTI funding, So typically, the sorts of projects that are aligned with what we try to support. So research and development and technical development, that's a really good fit for MTI funding. So, getting to a prototype, getting to a minimum viable product, doing some sort of testing, formulation, lab work, great fit for MTI funding. IP work, so patent searches, filings, freedom to operate analysis, that's a good fit. Pilot programs is another great fit. So going out and testing your product with real customers, additional engineering and design work, key hires that unblock technical or commercial progress. So again, for this one specifically, they have to be hires kind of linked to that technical commercial progress piece. And then regulatory work. Those are all typical MTI projects and generally a good fit. Um, Things that aren't really a fit, routine operating expenses, so just paying for your standard rent or utilities or general overhead, basically doing business as normal is not a fit for MTI funding. Inventory or production scale up, so just creating more of your product, not a great fit. Working capital, debt service, refinancing, equipment not tied to the innovation, so just buying random equipment your business needs, unless it's kind of linked to doing that pilot work or technical development work. Retroactive funding, so activities already completed. General sales activities, travel, with a few rare exceptions. We can occasionally support companies who are going to like a conference if it really makes sense for them to be at that conference, if they can make a really strong case that it's going to unlock some sales for them and they're at an appropriate stage to be going to the conference and showcasing their product. We can occasionally support, the conference fee. And then real estate purchases or construction is also not a fit for business innovation funding. So I already talked about criteria. So I already talked about kind of what are the key elements of fit. But the other thing is just how strong of a business do you have and how strong of a proposal. So in terms of the application you submit to MTI for funding, these are the things we analyze your application on, these six categories. So innovation and value proposition. So again, I've talked about innovation extensively, but basically, do you have a real innovation that your customers are excited about? And how can you prove that's true? Team. So do you have the people within your either within the founders or employees or advisors or mentors who have the relevant skills and oversight to execute the project? Is there a real market opportunity? So you might have a great innovation, but if there's only, realistically 100 customers in the world who want it, that's not a compelling market opportunity. We want you to demonstrate there's a sizable market. Business models and financials. So, does your business model make sense? How much is it going to cost to, sell your product? How much are you realistically going to be able to charge for it? And does all the math kind of add up to a profitable business at some point in the future? Impact and connection to Maine. So, is there a real impact potential? And then project structure. So is it a reasonably designed project with clear deliverables, clear timeline, right activities for where you are as a business. Um, so we're almost at the end here, and I appreciate everybody bearing with me. I know it's been a ton of information. So in terms of if you think, having heard all of this, that this might be a good fit for you, and you're like, I'd be interested in kind of moving forward and seeing as to whether or not business innovation is something that I might be able to pursue. The first step would be to take our self-assessment. So if you go to MTI and you click on Explore Funding and go to our Business Innovation Funding page, you'll see a few different links to the self-assessment, or you just Google MTI Business Innovation Funding. That self-assessment, it's just for your own knowledge and edification. You're not scored against it. Regardless of what you answer, we're not going to say, well, on the self-assessment, you picked this, so you're not eligible for MTI funding. It's really just a tool for you to figure out as to whether or not you might be a good fit. It asks you a series of questions, and it'll basically say, yes, you seem like you're a great fit. Well, you seem like you could be a fit. However, there's a couple areas you'll want to address, or no, it doesn't seem like you're a good fit. So that's definitely the first step. It's actually a required step for anybody who's coming to MTI for the first time. Um, if you self-assess as a good candidate, or even if you don't self-assess as a good candidate, but you still want to talk to somebody at MTI, you can submit an interest form. So once you complete the self-assessment, there'll be a link to submit the interest form. The interest form basically sets up a call with myself or one of my colleagues. We'll help talk through your innovation. If we determine that it seems like it's worth submitting an application, you can submit a funding request. You'll be expected to put forth a scope of work and a budget, which are basically describing what your project is, and an application form, and then await an MTI funding decision, which typically takes 1 to 2 months. And then if you're approved, you will be asked to do some reporting requirements depending on the nature of your funding. For grants, typically we just look for a final report at the end of the project. For loans and equity investments, we typically have some other criteria that we look to see. Whew. All right. Well, that is everything, but I'm happy to take any questions. So yeah, I'll turn it over to Dan to moderate that.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. We don't have any questions in the chat at the moment, but if anyone does have any questions, please feel free. You can unmute yourself using the unmute function, or if you'd like to put it in the chat, I can read it out loud. I don't know if Chris is still with us, but he did mention something earlier in the webinar about how he's seeking or he's looking for funding options and he does leadership development for science professionals.
He does leadership development for science professionals. So that might actually be so one thing I mentioned, that Maine Entrepreneurial Resource Corps program. That's a program that we offer to help startups hire consultants, hire people with specific areas of expertise. The other side of that, which I neglected to mention, is that we also maintain a database of consultants based in the state of Maine, um, who have certain capabilities. So, one thing that Chris should look into is potentially getting joined to that database. One of the great advantages as a consultant of being part of that database, it's a good way to get customer leads. So, when people come to MTI and say, hey, we have this need, we'll refer them to the database. And so that can be a good way to find customers. The other thing is because we help pay for that consulting engagement, so we pay for up to half of it 1 to 1. It can be a good way to kind of lower the cost to prospective customers because we're helping basically pay for the consulting service. So I would definitely encourage you, if you're a consultant, to get onboarded. Just go to Maine Entrepreneurial Resource Corps on our website, and at the very bottom, there's of that page, it says for consultants, and if you click that, you can set up a conversation with my colleague Emily, who manages that program, and she can help get you onboarded. The onboarding process is quite simple. You need a couple of references, a link to your website, proof that you're registered with the state of Maine, I think, but it's a quite low hanging fruit to get registered. So I definitely encourage anybody to do that. Oh, I'm seeing Chris put some more in the chat. I'm looking to build online training program certification style, which takes money. Understood. Yeah, that potentially could be a fit. Again, you need to meet that innovation component. So you need to show what you're doing is innovative, distinct from what sort of training programs are already out there, and then basically link that to growing and scaling the business in such a way that it's going to, lead to additional jobs. If it's just something that you're looking to develop that's going to allow you to offer your own offering, but it's not necessarily going to turn into additional jobs or scaling up as a main-based business, it probably wouldn't be a fit. But if you think it might, if it does meet those criteria, I'd suggest you take the self-assessment and submit an interest form.
Yeah, it doesn't look like we had any other questions pop up, so I do want to say thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today and telling us about MTI. I'll be sending out the recording of this workshop to everyone who is registered today, as well as follow up on other emails or other workshops that we have for SCORE coming up. Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone, for joining us today.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, so much. And again, apologies for being a few minutes late. I appreciate everybody's patience. And yeah, if you have any questions, like I said, please reach out to MTI and we'll be happy to chat with you. Take
Have a
care,
good
all.
one, everybody. Bye.